Don't touch me unless you mean it. He saved an Apache stranger and paid for it with love. John had always preferred the quiet of the desert. The vast stretches of sand and scrub brush, the endless sky and the warm sun on his back gave him a sense of peace he could not find anywhere else. He lived alone on his small ranch on the outskirts of a sleepy town in New Mexico, far from the noise and bustle of city life. Most days were simple, tending his cattle, repairing fences, or walking the dusty trails that ran through his property. John liked it that way. He liked routine. He liked knowing exactly what each day would bring. On this particular morning, John had risen before dawn. The first light had barely touched the horizon when he climbed into his old truck and drove out to check on the herd. The cows were scattered across the dry plain, their low moos echoing softly in the morning stillness. As John walked between the animals, counting heads and looking for any sign of trouble, he noticed something unusual in the distance. A figure, small and hunched, lying near a rocky outcrop. At first he thought it might be an animal, a coyote or maybe a stray dog, but as he got closer he realized it was a human. The man looked young, perhaps no older than 25, and his clothes were torn and dusty. One of his legs was bent at an awkward angle, and he clutched it tightly, wincing every few seconds. John slowed his pace and kept his distance, unsure of what to do. In all his years on the ranch, he had never found someone injured in the desert. He had heard stories of lost travelers and wanderers who got caught in sandstorms or attacked by wild animals, but he had never expected to face it himself. "Hey!" John called softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Are you all right?" The young man's eyes opened slowly. They were dark, alert, and filled with suspicion. He sat up slightly, leaning back against the rocks, and his voice, though soft, carried a warning. "Don't touch me, unless you mean it," he said. John froze for a moment, surprised by the intensity in the stranger's words. They weren't aggressive, but there was a caution, a barrier he could feel in the air between them. The man was clearly in pain, but he wanted to make sure John's intentions were genuine. John nodded slowly. "I mean no harm. I just want to help," he replied. The young man's lips pressed into a thin line, and he looked away. John stepped closer, careful not to startle him. He could see now that the man's leg was badly scraped, the skin raw and bleeding from the harsh rocks. His shirt was torn in several places, and his clothes were streaked with dirt and dried blood. John knew he could not leave him here. The desert could be cruel, and even a short fall or an untreated injury could become serious very quickly. "Let me at least get you some water," John said. He reached into his truck and grabbed a bottle from the cooler. "You need to drink something." The young man hesitated, his dark eyes wary, but the heat of the sun and his obvious thirst won over his pride. He took the bottle slowly, taking small sips as John watched carefully. When he had finished, he handed it back silently. John nodded, understanding that trust would take time. "I'm John," he said softly. "I live just over that hill. You can rest there, and I can help you get cleaned up." The man glanced at him and then at the truck. He didn't speak, but after a few tense moments, he nodded. John carefully helped him stand. The young man's leg trembled under his weight, and John supported him, keeping his own voice calm and reassuring. Step by step, they made their way to the truck, John steadying him whenever he faltered. Every movement had to be careful, gentle, because even a small jolt could make the injury worse. Once they were in the truck, John drove slowly back to the ranch. The young man remained silent, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. John wanted to break the quiet, to offer words that might ease his tension, but he didn't want to push. Silence, he thought, could sometimes be as comforting as conversation. When they arrived at the ranch, John guided him to a small room he had prepared for emergencies like this. It wasn't fancy, but it had a clean bed, fresh blankets, and a first aid kit. "You can rest here," John said. "I'll get the supplies ready to clean your leg." The young man sat on the edge of the bed, still cautious. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of vulnerability he hadn't shown before. John smiled gently. "You don't have to thank me yet. Just focus on getting better." As he began cleaning the wound, John could see the fear in the young man's eyes. He flinched when John's hands moved near the scrape, and he pulled back slightly. John stopped immediately. "I'll be gentle," he said. "I promise. I just want to help." The young man relaxed a little, allowing John to carefully wash away the dirt and apply antiseptic. He watched the process, his body tense but slowly easing as he realized that John's touch was indeed meant to help, not harm. The words he had spoken in the desert, "Don't touch me unless you mean it," echoed in John's mind. They were more than just a warning, they were a test of character. And John intended to pass it with patience and care. After the wound was cleaned and bandaged, John brought him a glass of water and some food. The young man hesitated at first, then took the food, eating slowly. John watched him, noticing the small signs of weariness, the way his hands shook slightly from pain or exhaustion. He could see that this man had been through something difficult, perhaps more than John could imagine. "Where did you come from?" John asked gently, trying to keep his tone neutral and kind. The young man looked down at his hands, twisting them nervously. I was traveling," he said finally. "I got lost." He didn't say more, but John didn't press. He knew the story would come in time when the man was ready. For now, all that mattered was that he was safe, that he had water, food, and a chance to rest. John sat nearby, keeping watch, making sure the stranger knew he was not alone. The desert could be unforgiving, and in that moment, John felt a deep sense of responsibility. Hours passed quietly. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows through the room. The young man drifted off to sleep, his breathing slow and steady. John sat in a chair nearby, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had brought this stranger into his life. He had come out to check his herd, expecting a routine morning, and instead found a man in need, someone whose trust would not be given lightly. As the evening approached, John prepared a small dinner, leaving it near the bed so the young man could eat when he woke. He cleaned up the supplies, stacked the bandages neatly, and checked the locks on the doors. Everything was ready, and everything was calm. Yet John knew this was only the beginning. The man had come with a story, and John had a feeling that it was going to be complicated, perhaps even life-changing. Still, for now, there was peace. There was the quiet hum of the desert outside, the gentle rustle of wind through the trees, and the soft breathing of a man who had survived the harsh landscape, if only by chance and by John's timely intervention. In that quiet room, surrounded by the warmth of his home and the fading light of the desert sun, John realized something important. Sometimes, the most unexpected meetings could mark the start of something extraordinary, and for the first time the young man's words, "Don't touch me unless you mean it," felt less like a warning and more like the beginning of a connection, a fragile trust that could grow if handled with care. John resolved to honor that trust, knowing that in helping this stranger, he was stepping into a story that neither of them could have predicted. The next morning, the desert light poured through the small window of John's ranch house. The young man stirred on the bed, blinking against the brightness. His dark eyes met John's, who was quietly sitting in the chair across the room, sipping a cup of coffee. There was a calm tension in the air, a delicate balance between curiosity and caution. The young man had slept through the night, but he had not spoken much, and John knew that trust could not be rushed. "Good morning," John said softly. He placed a small plate of breakfast on the table beside the bed, some eggs, bread, and fruit. The smell made the young man's stomach rumble, though he looked at the food uncertainly. John smiled. "Eat when you're ready. No pressure." The young man nodded, still quiet. He did not speak his name again, nor did he offer more about where he came from. John decided to respect that. Some stories he knew took time to tell. For now, it was enough that the man was awake and able to eat. After breakfast, John helped him to his feet and guided him to the small porch outside. The morning air was crisp and fresh, and the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. The young man leaned on a wooden railing, looking out at the horizon with a thoughtful expression. John watched him, noticing how alert he was to every sound. The distant call of a hawk, the rustle of the wind through the brush. It was clear he was used to surviving in harsh conditions, always aware of his surroundings. "You've been through a lot," John said carefully. "It shows in how you carry yourself." The young man's gaze flicked toward him, but he said nothing. Instead, he bent slightly, examining a small stone in his hand, rolling it over his fingers. John understood the silence. Sometimes words were too heavy, too complicated, to share right away. Over the next few days, John focused on helping him heal physically. He cleaned and redressed the wound daily, carefully monitoring for signs of infection. He brought fresh water, simple meals, and a quiet presence. The young man, who John finally learned was named Tayanita, resisted help at first, flinching whenever John's hands moved too close. But gradually he allowed John to tend to his injuries without pulling away. During this time, John learned more about Tayanita through small moments, through actions, gestures, and unspoken words. He watched how Tayanita observed the world around him, noting the way he reacted to the wind or the sun or the movement of birds. Tayanita seemed to study John as well, learning whether he could be trusted, whether the quiet words and careful touch carried honesty. Each day, the tension in his shoulders softened slightly. One afternoon, John suggested they take a short walk around the ranch. Tayanita hesitated, looking at the uneven ground, then down at his leg. John smiled reassuringly. "We'll go slow," he said. "You don't have to rush." They moved carefully at first, John supporting Tayanita when he stumbled. As they walked, John began to tell small stories about the ranch, the time a calf got stuck in a fence, or the story of a wild horse that had wandered near the property years ago. He spoke lightly, without pressing for information in return. Slowly, Tayanita began to respond. A small chuckle here, a soft nod there. He started to relax, allowing himself to be present in the moment without the constant guard he usually carried. Evenings were the hardest. Tayanita often stared out the window into the fading light, silent and tense. John could see the pain in his eyes, not just physical, but emotional. It was clear that whatever had brought Tayanita into the desert had left deeper wounds than the scratches and bruises John could tend to. John understood that healing would take more than medicine and rest. It would take patience, understanding, and perhaps something harder to give: trust. John decided to take another approach. He began leaving small gifts: a fresh blanket, a carefully written note, or a small token from the ranch, like a smooth stone or a feather. Tayanita would pick them up quietly, sometimes examining them, sometimes just placing them aside, but John noticed that he began to smile occasionally, if only a little. The smallest gestures mattered more than grand words. One night, a strong wind blew across the desert. It rattled the windows and shook the trees. Tayanita woke suddenly, frightened by the sound. John was at his side immediately, offering a hand to hold and a calm voice to soothe. "It's all right," he said. "You're safe here." Tayanita hesitated, then allowed John's hand to rest lightly on his shoulder. It was a small touch, but it carried immense significance, a first sign of trust. As days turned into weeks, their routines became familiar. John would work outside, and Tayanita would sit on the porch, sometimes helping with simple tasks like feeding chickens or gathering firewood. He moved carefully, mindful of his leg, but he began to laugh quietly at John's jokes or shake his head at small mistakes. It was subtle, but it was progress. The wall Tayanita had built around himself was slowly cracking, and John recognized that it was more fragile than it appeared. One afternoon, Tayanita finally spoke more freely. They were sitting near the small pond on the ranch, watching the sun reflect off the water. I have not had much help before," he said quietly. "People, they leave, or they hurt you, or they don't care." His voice was heavy with a lifetime of disappointment and pain. John listened without interrupting, nodding gently. "I understand," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Tayanita's eyes softened slightly. "Why do you help me?" he asked. His voice was low, hesitant, almost afraid of the answer. John smiled simply. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "Because you needed help. Because sometimes people deserve kindness, even if they don't ask for it." For a long moment, Tayanita looked away, staring at the horizon. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "I thank you." John didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, letting the moment linger. He understood that words could only go so far. Actions, the gentle care, the patience, the small touches that respected boundaries, were worth far more than any explanation. Over the next few days, Tayanita began to move more confidently around the ranch. He helped John with small chores, fetching water, stacking firewood, or repairing fences. John never rushed him or expected more than he was capable of. Tayanita's independence returned slowly, like a river carving its path through stone. He began to smile more freely, even laugh softly when something amused him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Tayanita spoke again. "I never thought anyone like you would care for me," he said, his voice quiet but steady. John looked at him, feeling the weight of those words. "People can surprise you," John said softly. "Sometimes they do." It was a turning point. Tayanita's walls had not completely fallen, but they were no longer impenetrable. He began to let John see the person he truly was, a person shaped by hardship, but still capable of trust and connection. And John, in turn, saw not only the struggles Tayanita had endured, but also his resilience, his intelligence, and the quiet strength he carried beneath the surface. By the end of the second week, their connection had deepened, built on small acts of care, shared silence, and the understanding that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. Tayanita's injuries were healing, but more importantly, his fear and suspicion were easing. He had begun to allow himself to belong somewhere, to be part of someone else's world without fear of betrayal. John watched him one evening, leaning against the railing and staring at the sky. He thought about how fragile trust could be, yet how powerful it was when nurtured with patience. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, that Tyanita's past would continue to cast shadows. But for the first time, John felt a quiet optimism. The desert had brought them together unexpectedly, but now it was teaching them both something more profound. That kindness, patience, and respect could heal wounds far deeper than any medicine, and that trust, once earned, could create a bond stronger than fear. And so their days continued, each one a careful dance of patience, understanding, and small victories. Each step forward, each shared smile, each quiet moment of trust was a brick in the foundation of something new, something neither of them had expected, but both were beginning to hope for. Life on the ranch had settled into a gentle rhythm, but for Tyanita, the quiet days often brought difficult memories. The desert could be peaceful, yes, but it also reminded him of how alone he had been for so long. Even in the company of John, he sometimes felt the weight of his past pressing down, uninvited and relentless. He carried it silently in the small gestures of hesitation, the way he flinched at sudden movements, and the guarded look in his eyes whenever strangers passed by the ranch. John noticed it immediately. Though Tyanita had begun to trust him, there were moments when something invisible tugged at him, making him tense and withdrawn. John didn't ask questions he didn't need to ask, but he observed carefully, ready to step in when needed. He had learned by now that patience was not just about waiting. It was about understanding, supporting, and knowing when to let silence speak. One morning, a neighbor rode up on horseback. He had heard rumors of a stranger staying at John's ranch, and he was curious. John greeted him politely, but noticed Tyanita stiffen in the doorway. The neighbor's questions were casual, but Tyanita's body language was tense, almost as if he were preparing to defend himself. John realized that Tyanita's past had not only shaped him emotionally, but also taught him to be wary of outsiders. When the neighbor left, John sat beside Tyanita on the porch. "You're safe here," John said softly. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Tyanita's eyes flicked to him, dark and troubled. "I've been hurt before," he said quietly. "People I trusted, people I cared about. They left me. Some wanted to hurt me." His voice broke slightly, and John could see the old fear surfacing again. John placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. Tyanita flinched at first, but did not pull away. "I know," John said gently. "I can't change what happened, but I can be here for you now, and I will stay." For a few minutes neither of them spoke. The sun warmed their faces. The wind rustled softly through the trees, and the sound of cattle moving in the distance filled the silence. It was a small moment, but one of profound significance. Tyanita had allowed John to touch him, to comfort him, even though the memories were heavy. Trust, he realized, was fragile but powerful. The following days brought small challenges. Tyanita's wounds were healing physically, but emotional wounds often revealed themselves unexpectedly. One afternoon, John was repairing a fence when he noticed Tyanita standing at the edge of the property, staring off into the distance. There was a tension in his posture, a shadow over his face. John walked over slowly. "You're thinking," John said gently, more as an observation than a question. Tyanita turned, his expression tight. "I remember the people who hurt me," he admitted. "I try not to, but sometimes it comes back." John nodded. "It's okay to remember. It doesn't mean it controls you." Tyanita hesitated, then spoke again. "I trusted someone once, and they betrayed me. I don't want to feel that pain again." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of loneliness and disappointment. John crouched to look him in the eyes. "I'm not them," he said simply. "I'm here, and I won't leave you. You can trust me." The words were not dramatic, but they mattered. Tayanita's body relaxed just slightly, the tension easing from his shoulders. He still carried his past, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he could share the burden with someone who would not betray him. Evening brought another challenge. A sudden storm rolled in from the mountains, heavy clouds covering the sky, lightning flashing in the distance. Rain began to fall in strong sheets, drumming against the roof of the ranch house. Tayanita was terrified, the storm bringing back memories of nights spent alone in the desert, with no shelter and no one to protect him. John noticed his fear immediately. He guided him to the living room, offering a warm blanket and a cup of tea. "It's all right," John said. "You're safe here. Nothing can reach you." For hours they sat together, listening to the storm, watching the lightning streak across the sky. Tayanita stayed close, leaning slightly against John. It was a simple act, but a huge step forward. The trust that had been carefully built over weeks was solidifying. Tayanita was beginning to understand that he could allow himself to rely on someone again. In the quiet that followed the storm, Tayanita began to share fragments of his past. "I was traveling with people I thought I could trust," he said softly. "We were attacked. I lost them, and I ran. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who would help me." His words came slowly, each one measured, like stepping carefully on fragile ground. John listened quietly, letting him speak without interruption. He could feel the pain in every word, the fear that had shaped Tayanita for years. And yet, he also felt the courage it took for Tayanita to speak at all. He knew that healing was not only about tending to the body, but also allowing the heart to release what it had held for too long. "You survived," John said softly. "You're here. You're alive. And now you're safe. I'll help you make sure it stays that way." Tayanita's eyes glistened, and he nodded. It was a small acknowledgement, but it carried enormous meaning. He was beginning to let go of some of the pain, to accept that not everyone would hurt him, that someone could care for him without expecting anything in return. The next few days were quieter. Tayanita moved more confidently around the ranch, helping John with small chores and tasks. He still had moments of hesitation, but they were becoming less frequent. He began to smile more, even laugh quietly when something amused him. Each small gesture, each shared task, was another step toward rebuilding his sense of safety and trust. John noticed the changes, but he also understood that progress was never a straight line. There would be setbacks, moments of fear or doubt, and that was okay. Healing, he knew, was a journey, not a destination. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the desert in golden light, Tayanita approached John with a small bundle of freshly gathered herbs. "For your cooking," he said quietly. It was a simple gift, but it spoke volumes. He was participating, contributing, showing care in a way that went beyond words. John smiled, touched. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That's very thoughtful of you." Tayanita nodded, a faint smile on his lips. It was a small victory, but one that symbolized the trust and bond that had grown between them. The walls Tayanita had built around himself were not gone, but they were no longer impenetrable. He had allowed John into his life, into his world, and he was beginning to understand that vulnerability did not always lead to pain. It could lead to connection, understanding, and even something resembling peace. As night fell, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. The desert was quiet, the only sounds the distant call of an owl and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Tyanita leaned slightly against John, not fully, but enough to show that he felt safe. John didn't speak. He didn't need to. The quiet companionship, the shared understanding was enough. In those moments, John realized that saving Tyanita had not only been about tending to his physical wounds, it had been about creating a space where trust could grow, where past pain could be acknowledged but not allowed to dominate the present. And Tyanita, in turn, was learning that it was possible to allow someone into his life without fear, to accept care, and to begin healing in ways he had thought impossible. The bond between them grew stronger every day, built on patience, understanding, and the small acts of kindness that mattered more than grand gestures. Tyanita's laughter returned slowly, his confidence in the world increased, and he began to imagine a life beyond the fear that had shaped him for so long. Yet John knew that challenges would continue. Tyanita's past was still there, a shadow that could return unexpectedly. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Together, they could face whatever came next, knowing that the desert had brought them together for a reason, and that their connection, fragile though it might be, was growing stronger with every passing day. And so, life continued on the ranch. Each day was a careful balance of work, conversation, silence, and shared moments. Tyanita's past had left deep scars, but with John's steady presence and patient care, he was beginning to learn that trust could be rebuilt, that kindness could exist even in a world that had once felt harsh and unforgiving. In the heart of the desert, amidst the quiet beauty of the land, Tyanita was beginning to feel something he had not felt in a long time. Hope, and hope, he realized, was the first step toward healing completely. The weeks passed quietly on the ranch, and the bond between John and Tyanita grew steadily. They shared more laughter, worked together more efficiently, and Tyanita even began to sleep more peacefully at night. But life, as it often does, has a way of testing the connections that seem strongest. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills, dark clouds appeared on the horizon. At first, John thought it was just the usual desert weather, but as the wind picked up, he realized a storm was approaching, one unlike any they had experienced recently. The sky darkened quickly, the air grew heavy, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Tyanita immediately tensed. His past had taught him to fear sudden storms, not for the rain itself, but for the unpredictability that came with it. He glanced at the hills and then back at John. "Storms like this," he murmured, his voice tense. "They bring trouble." John understood immediately. "We'll stay inside," he said firmly. "Nothing's going to hurt you here, I promise." The wind grew stronger, and the rain came down in sheets. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by thunder that rattled the walls of the small ranch house. Tyanita flinched at each strike, gripping the edge of a chair as if holding on could protect him from the memories flooding back. John stayed close, offering quiet reassurance. "You're safe," he repeated, his voice calm and steady. "I'm right here. Nothing can get to you." Despite John's words, the fear in Tyanita's eyes was unmistakable. The storm reminded him of nights he had spent alone, vulnerable with no one to turn to. He had survived, yes, but the fear had never truly left him. Tonight, it was back, stronger than ever. Hours passed, and the storm raged on. The wind howled and the rain pounded against the roof. Tayanita stayed close to John, leaning slightly against him for support. John understood what this meant. It was more than physical comfort. Tayanita was allowing himself to rely on someone completely, to trust that he would be protected no matter what came. As the storm began to ease, a sudden knock at the door startled the both. John moved cautiously to the door, peeking outside to see a figure standing in the rain. It was a man, drenched, looking both desperate and dangerous. He carried an air of urgency that made John's instincts flare. "Tayanita," the stranger called, his voice harsh. "We need to go now. You belong with us." Tayanita froze. His eyes widened with fear, and his body tensed as if ready to flee. John stepped between him and the stranger. Who are you?" he demanded. "And what do you want from him?" The man's expression darkened. "He owes us. He left, and now it's time to pay." "There's no choice." John's heart pounded. He realized immediately that Tayanita's past had caught up with him. These were the people who had betrayed him, the ones who had caused him so much pain, and now they had come to claim him. Tayanita stepped back, but his eyes met John's. "I can't go back," he said, his voice shaking. They'll hurt me." John nodded firmly. "Then you won't go back," he said. "Not while I'm here. You're safe. I won't let them take you." The man outside banged on the door again, more insistently this time. "Open up. You can't hide him forever." John took a deep breath and held the door shut. He turned to Tayanita. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone." The hours that followed were tense. The storm had left the ground slippery, and the stranger outside was persistent, but John refused to panic. Together, he and Tayanita worked quietly, moving things around the house to make it secure. John explained each step, reassuring Tayanita that he would protect him, that they would not give in to fear. Through it all, Tayanita began to see something he hadn't before. John's strength. It wasn't the kind of strength that came from force or aggression. It was calm, unwavering, and patient. John's presence gave him courage. For the first time, Tayanita realized that he could face his past, that he could confront the people who had hurt him, and that he would not be alone. As night fell, the stranger outside finally gave up, retreating into the darkness. John waited until he could hear nothing but the distant rumble of the storm fading away. Then he turned to Tayanita. "It's over for now," he said softly. "You're safe. I've got you." Tayanita's shoulders slumped with relief, but he was exhausted. He had been through the storm, both outside and within himself. He had faced his fear head on, and John had been there every step of the way. In that moment, Tayanita realized something profound. He could trust someone completely. The next few days were quieter, but they were filled with reflection. Tayanita spent time looking out over the desert, thinking about the storm, the stranger, and the courage he had found within himself. He began to understand that fear could be faced, that the past could be acknowledged without allowing it to control him, and that love and trust could be a guiding force even in the darkest moments. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Tayanita finally spoke again about his past. "I ran because I thought I had no choice," he said quietly. "I left everyone behind. I thought I was alone. But you were here. You stayed. You didn't leave me." John nodded. "I'll always stay," he said simply. "I won't abandon you. Not now. Not ever." Tayanita's eyes softened, and he leaned slightly toward John, letting the warmth of the fire and the safety of the room sink in. It was a small gesture, but it carried enormous meaning. He was allowing himself to be vulnerable, to rely on someone fully, and to feel the beginning of love, a connection that had grown slowly, patiently, and with care. Over the following weeks, Tayanita continued to recover, both physically and emotionally. He worked alongside John, helping with the ranch, learning new skills and sharing stories of his past when he felt ready. He laughed more, slept better, and began to dream again about a future where he was not defined by fear. The storm and the confrontation with the stranger had changed something in him. He realized that he was no longer the same person who had wandered the desert alone and afraid. He had found someone who cared, who protected him, and who respected him. He had found trust, and more than that, he had found love. One evening, as the sun set and the desert sky was painted with orange and pink, Tayanita turned to John. I never thought I could feel this way," he said softly. "I never thought I could trust anyone like this, or care for someone like this." John looked at him, his own heart full. "You can," he said. "And you do. You've earned it, and so have I." In that moment, the world outside, the desert, the past, the storms, seemed to fade away. There was only the quiet warmth of the ranch, the trust they had built, and the beginning of something that neither of them had expected but both had wanted, a love that was patient, steady, and real. The storm had tested them, but it had also shown them the strength of their bond. Tayanita had faced his past, and John had been there every step of the way. Together they had survived fear, uncertainty, and the shadows of old wounds, and in doing so they had discovered that the deepest connections are often formed in moments of challenge, courage, and shared vulnerability. As the desert night settled around the ranch, Tayanita finally allowed himself to relax completely, knowing that he was safe, loved, and truly home. And John, watching him, knew that the journey they had begun together was only just starting, but that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The desert had grown calm again. The storms had passed, the stranger had retreated, and for the first time in weeks, John and Tayanita could breathe without fear. The ranch was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun, and even the cattle seemed to sense the peace that had returned. Yet John knew that the journey they had shared had changed both of them forever. The past would always be a part of Tayanita, but the future, he hoped, could be something brighter, something full of trust, care, and love. Tayanita emerged from his room slowly, stretching his arms and looking around the ranch. He had spent countless nights awake, thinking of his past, worrying about danger, and learning to trust John in small, deliberate steps. Now, he felt a sense of calm he had not known in years. He walked to the porch where John was already preparing breakfast over a small stove. The aroma of eggs and fresh bread filled the air, and the desert sunlight glinted off the horizon. John looked up and smiled. "Morning," he said simply. "Sleep well?" Tayanita nodded, a soft smile touching his lips. "Better than I have in a long time," he admitted. It was the truth. He had begun to sleep without constant fear, without imagining threats around every corner. The quiet presence of John had given him that gift. Breakfast was a slow, peaceful affair. They talked about small things, the weather, the cattle, the fences that needed repair, and the chores for the day. There was no tension, no fear, only companionship. It was a new kind of normal, one that Tayanita had long thought impossible. And yet, he realized, he had come to enjoy it. The simplicity, the safety, and the connection with John. After breakfast, John suggested they take a walk around the ranch, as they had done before. But this time, Tayanita moved with confidence. His leg was strong, his body steady, and his mind calm. They walked slowly along the edge of the property, observing the desert flora, listening to the birds, and feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces. It was a simple pleasure, but one Tayanita had not experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of being part of something, of being home. As they reached the small pond near the edge of the ranch, Tayanita paused. He bent down and scooped up a handful of water, letting it flow slowly through his fingers. He watched the ripples spread across the surface, and for a moment he let himself reflect on how far he had come. He thought of the desert where he had been alone, scared and injured. He thought of the stranger who had come to claim him, the fear that had gripped him during the storm, and the countless nights of worry and hesitation. And he thought of John. I never knew peace like this could exist, Tayanita said softly, almost to himself. He glanced at John, who was watching him with quiet patience. I thought the world would always be dangerous. That, trust, was a weakness. But you've shown me something different. John smiled, placing a hand gently on Tayanita's shoulder. Trust isn't weakness, he said. It's courage, and you've shown more courage than most people I've met. Tayanita looked down, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. I never imagined someone could care for me this much, he admitted. I've been alone for so long. I didn't think anyone could stay. John shook his head. I'm here, he said simply. I'll stay. You don't have to be alone anymore. Tayanita's eyes filled with emotion. He had wanted this, wanted connection, care, and safety. But he had been afraid to hope, afraid to trust, afraid to let someone in. And yet, here he was, standing beside John, realizing that he could finally allow himself to feel something he had long thought impossible. The days that followed were filled with small joys and shared moments. Tayanita helped John repair fences, gather firewood, and tend to the animals. They cooked meals together, laughed at small mistakes, and shared stories of their pasts when they felt ready. Every action, every word, every glance reinforced the bond that had grown between them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink, John suggested they sit outside and watch the stars appear. The sky gradually darkened, revealing countless points of light that stretched across the horizon. The desert was quiet, save for the soft rustle of wind and the distant call of a coyote. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, and Tayanita felt it deeply. He turned to John, his voice quiet but steady. I never thought I could feel this safe, he said, or this happy. But you've given me something I never had before. John reached out and took Tayanita's hand, holding it gently. You've given me something too, he said. Your trust. Your friendship. And I think I've found something I never expected either. Tayanita's eyes softened, and he leaned closer, resting his head briefly against John's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. It was the culmination of weeks of trust, patience, and care. It was the physical expression of a bond that had grown slowly but surely, a bond built on understanding, respect, and genuine love. As night fell, they continued to sit together, sharing stories and quiet conversation. The stars twinkled above, the desert stretching endlessly around them, and for the first time, Tayanita felt fully at peace. He had faced his past, confronted his fears, and learned to trust again. He had found safety, companionship, and love in a place he had once thought empty and dangerous. Over the next few weeks, the bond between John and Tayanita deepened further. They worked together on the ranch, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other in ways that strengthened their connection. Tayanita began to open up more about his past, telling John stories of his childhood, the people he had lost, and the experiences that had shaped him. John listened patiently, never judging, never pushing, simply offering a steady presence and understanding. One afternoon, after a long day of work, they sat by the pond, watching the water ripple in the sunlight. Tayanita turned to John, his expression serious but calm. "I want you to know something," he said softly. I care for you more than I've ever cared for anyone. And I love you." John's eyes widened slightly, a smile spreading across his face. He reached out and took Tayanita's hand in both of his, squeezing gently. "I love you too," he said. "I've felt it for a long time and I've wanted you to know it. You've changed my life too, Tayanita." For a long moment they sat quietly, holding hands, feeling the weight of those words and the depth of their connection. The desert around them seemed to hum with life, the wind whispering through the trees, the sun casting warm light across the land. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, one that marked the culmination of everything they had been through. In the following days, life on the ranch became a new kind of normal. Tayanita worked alongside John, their relationship strengthened by shared effort, trust, and love. They laughed together, shared meals, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of desert life. Tayanita's past no longer defined him. He was free to live fully, to love, and to trust without fear. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Tayanita turned to John and smiled. "I never imagined life could be like this," he said softly. "I never imagined I could be happy. But you've shown me that it's possible. You've given me hope and love and home." John smiled back, squeezing his hand gently. "You've given me all of that too," he said. "And I'm grateful every day that we found each other." The desert around them was calm, the sky painted with warm colors, and the ranch filled with the quiet peace of a life rebuilt. Tayanita had survived storms, fear, and loneliness, and in the end he had found something greater than safety alone. He had found love, trust, and a place to belong. And in John's steady presence, he knew he would never have to face the world alone again. They had come through challenges together, healed together, and loved together, and that was the greatest victory of all. As night fell and the stars blanketed the sky, they sat side by side, hands intertwined, hearts connected, and souls at peace. The desert, which had once seemed harsh and unforgiving, now felt like a home full of possibilities, hope, and enduring love. And together, John and Tayanita knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, stronger and braver than ever before.